Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned for the last Friday of the year. My goodness, the last Friday of 2024. Time flies, man. But it is time for the book of the week. What book am I going to be talking about this week? Oh, the thrill and the suspense. It's not suspenseful. You already saw the thumbnail. So here we are talking about Robert Louis Stevenson. This is the selected writings of Robert Louis Stevenson. This is a modern library giant. It's giant. It's a pretty big book. So this is from the Modern Library. This was published in 1947. And the Modern Library, they put out these compact, relatively inexpensive hardcover editions of classic literature, but they also came out with these giants. So yes, the Modern Library, they published the world's best books, but they also published these big giants, which were either collections or anthologies, or omnibus volumes of different writers. Sometimes they were just really big books, like War and Peace. That was just really big, so it was a giant. And in the flap here, it'll show you some other giants. That'll give you an example. Tom Jones was a giant, and so was the complete novels of Jane Austen, and The Moonstone and the Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, the short stories of Henry James, that was a giant, and my personal favorite giant, Great Tales of Terror and the Supernatural, which I did a whole video on, I think. I did a whole video on that. That was a library essential right there, bookshelf essential. So today we're talking about this one though, Robert Louis Stevenson, who was a great writer, best remembered today for two books, which would be, of course, Treasure Island and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is by far probably his best remembered book and his most influential book. It is, in fact, one of the greatest stories in the English language. It is enormously influential, Dr. Jekyll. I mean, it's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I mean, it's had a huge cultural impact. So yeah, he will never escape from that. But he wrote all kinds of things. And this is his selected writings. And it's a great book because it has a really interesting table of contents. They packed a lot in here. You know, it is a giant, but even though they packed so much in here, there was stuff that was left out that I would have preferred that was left in. Most egregiously, what was left out in this was Kidnapped, which I just think is just a great book. I understand why that's not in here, though. That is an adventure story in the vein of Treasure Island. So if you're going to have to take one of those out, if you're going to have to exclude one of those for space, it's not going to be Treasure Island. It's just not. That's one of his greatest books. So you have to keep Treasure Island in. But I do miss Kidnapped not being in here because, like I said, great book, man. But he wrote a lot of good stuff, a lot of interesting things. He was an interesting guy, Robert Louis Stevenson. Scottish writer. Always was a bit different, you know. Very intelligent man, thought about stuff quite deeply. Had a lot of adventures. He was never in the best health. This guy. But that didn't stop him from living a really interesting life. Traveled all around. He met his wife when she was 10 years older than he was and married. I think she was married. Didn't stop him, no. Things all worked out. Unfortunately, like I said, he was never in the best of health, and he died young. I think he was 44 years old when he died. And it was a stroke, I think, that he died from. And that is tremendously sad, not just for him, but for us, because we lost out on what could have been a lot of other great books and stories. But what is in this massive thing anyway? Well, let's take a look. So, if I could find the table of contents, here we go. Okay, so novels. So it does have Treasure Island. It also has The Master of Ballantrae and The Weir of Hermiston. I'm probably mispronouncing all of those things. I can't pronounce anything. I could pronounce it well if I had a Scottish accent, but you don't want to hear me try to do it. It would be bad. And then we've got short stories. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is really a novella, I guess if it's anything, is in here under short stories. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, probably the most important story in this volume. But also we have a bunch of other stories that are really interesting. We've got The Suicide Club, which is a great story. The Bottle Imp is in here. The Body Snatcher, great horror story. Providence and the Guitar. And here is a story I can't pronounce. The Sire of de la Matroit's Door. A Lodging for the Night, Markheim. Thrawn Janet and the Beach of Fallassé. Or Fallassah, I don't know. But those are the stories. So that's the fiction, but he did a lot more than just that. He wrote a lot of nonfiction as well, and you never find that anywhere. And nobody reads it, I don't think, anymore. For such a great writer, very little of his stuff is read nowadays. Treasure Island, I still see people talking about that. And of course, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde will always be read because it's such a great story and so important. But he wrote a lot of stuff, man. And that includes his essays. And he's got a lot of essays in here. But he also has some other stuff. He's got books of travel. And his books of travel are some of the most interesting things that he wrote. He's got Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes. The Cevennes? Man, I should have learned how to pronounce these words before I got up this morning. The Royal Sport of Nautique and the Silverado Squatters. I remember the Silverado Squatters being really interesting. But he also has many poems and ballads. So we have lots of poems to round out this volume. And it's just really interesting stuff. And I highly recommend anything from Robert Louis Stevenson. It's always worth reading. I mean, maybe he wrote a couple things that weren't great. What was it? The Black Arrow? The Black Arrow wasn't bad. It just didn't measure up to his other stuff. But certainly everything in here is really, really interesting. All of his stuff is in the public domain, so you don't have to try to scrounge up this volume. You could just look for his stuff on Project Gutenberg and see what's there. I'm pretty sure everything in here is there in one form or another. His short story collections, all that stuff will be there. His travel writing, memoirs, stuff like that. You could find all that stuff pretty easily digitally. This book you can still find. It's not always in the greatest shape. It was published in 1947. But while you might not find this book, I certainly do recommend that you read this author. Like I said, he's read nowadays for 2 books. And that's pretty much it. But Kidnapped sometimes. Definitely read that. That's a really good book. He wrote a lot of great stuff. You should read Robert Louis Stevenson. He's awesome. Okay, I'll shut up. And I will come back next time. Maybe tomorrow? Definitely Sunday. I'll be back